Rodriguez's smirk hit harder than the slammed locker door. Maybe next time, sweetheart. Sarah's knuckles whitened around her helmet. 3 years of flawless scores, 3 years of being told to wait her turn, and now the Syria mission, the one she'd bled for in training, was handed to the man who'd once buried an Apache in a sand dune. She could have swallowed it. She'd done that before. But then her phone buzzed. A message from Jake, her little brother, fighting real enemies in Afghanistan. Finally gonna see some action, sis? She couldn't text back the truth, that the army trusted her to train rookies but not to fight. And she didn't know, not yet, that in less than 24 hours her shot wouldn't come from a war zone. It would come from the eye of a monster. One that ripped cities apart and left children clinging to rooftops, waiting for a rescue that would never come, unless she took it. She'd step into winds that could peel paint from steel. She'd fly where no sane pilot dared, with nothing but a gunship, a plan, and a prayer. And she'd carve her name into the kind of story they tell decades later. Because some people earn their call sign from politics. Sarah Hurricane Mitchell earned hers by refusing to crash. Lieutenant Sarah Ghost Mitchell slammed her helmet into the metal locker hard enough to make the steel ring. The sound cracked through the empty ready room at Fort Bragg like a gunshot, echoing off the walls and ricocheting back at her. A sharp punctuation mark to 3 relentless years of patience, discipline, and quietly swallowed disappointment. On the wall-mounted mission board, the black marker scrawl of Captain Rodriguez now sat beside Operation Desert Falcon, the high-priority reconnaissance run into Syrian territory that she had been drilling for since sunrise. Weeks of preparation, months of training, years of building her record into something unassailable. And once again, the slot had gone to someone else. Rough day, Mitchell? Staff Sergeant Chun's head appeared around the corner. His coveralls were stained with streaks of hydraulic fluid, the kind of grime that clung to anyone who spent their life elbow deep in an Apache's innards. He had been working on her helicopter all morning, tuning the targeting systems to a level of precision she'd probably never be allowed to test in a real firefight. Same as every other day, Chun, she said flatly, her voice clipped. She gave her flight bag a frustrated kick, sending it skidding across the polished floor. 3 years of flawless training evaluations, 3 years of simulator scores no one could touch, and not a single combat mission to show for it. Meanwhile, Rodriguez just kept landing the glory runs. Chun stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him as though sealing them off from the rest of the base. His tone dropped into a conspiratorial whisper. You know what happened last week during that night vision exercise, right? Rodriguez couldn't hit a target the size of a barn door. Got so turned around he had to abort the run entirely. Sarah had heard the rumors in the chow hall and the hangar bays, but hearing it straight from Chun tightened something low in her gut. She remembered that same exercise, flying her Apache through a winding canyon course in total darkness, every shot hitting dead center, 12 for 12. The official report had called her performance exceptional. And yet, here she was, benched again, while Rodriguez packed for war. The ready room door swung wide with a burst of confidence that seemed rehearsed. Captain Rodriguez strutted in, his flight suit crisp as if it had been pressed that morning, aviator sunglasses perched carelessly on his head despite the absence of sunlight. Mitchell, he drawled, his smile carrying the smugness of someone who had never worried about earning their slot. Heard you had your eye on the Syria run. Maybe next time, sweetheart. Her hands curled into fists before she realized it. Maybe if you could actually fly without plowing into sand dunes, there wouldn't be a next time, she shot back, her tone icy, referring to last month's training fiasco everyone had politely agreed to pretend never happened. Rodriguez's easy grin faltered. That was equipment failure, and you know it. He stepped closer, voice dropping into something sharp and condescending. Combat flying isn't about simulators and perfect target scores. It's about having the guts to pull this trigger when someone's shooting back. Some people just don't have it when the bullets start flying. Before she could respond, he was already walking away, leaving behind the faint trace of expensive cologne and the heavier stink of arrogance. Sarah stood alone in the ready room. Around her, the walls were lined with framed photographs of missions she'd never flown, commendations she'd never been awarded, and the crushing weight of expectations she'd been trained to meet, but never allowed to fulfill. That evening, she found herself wandering the flight line as the sun bled into the horizon, washing the North Carolina sky in deep orange and copper. The Apaches sat in perfect formation, their sleek, predatory silhouettes frozen against the glow like great hunting birds at rest. She stopped beside her assigned bird, Orsoban, tail number 847, and ran her fingers along the armored fuselage. This machine could level an enemy position in seconds. It could execute precision strikes with surgical accuracy. But in her hands, it had never been used for anything more dangerous than training sorties and supply runs. Her phone buzzed, a message from Jake, her younger brother, halfway across the world with the Marines in Afghanistan. Saw the news about your unit deploying. Finally going to see some action, sis. She stared at the text until the words blurred. She didn't have the heart to tell him that yes, the unit was deploying, but she'd be staying behind, grounded yet again, training the next wave of pilots who would see the fight. The irony bit deep. She was good enough to teach others how to kill, just not good enough to be trusted with the killing herself. The breaking point came the next morning. From the observation tower, she watched Rodriguez line up for a precision strike on a mock enemy site. His first missile hit 50 meters wide, kicking up a harmless wall of sand. His second shot landed closer, but still outside the target zone. On the third run, a sudden gust of wind caught the Apache mid-dive. Rodriguez overcorrected, and in seconds the chopper was dropping in a lurching, uncontrolled descent. The impact buried the landing gear deep into a sand dune. The investigation later blamed weather and equipment failure. But through her binoculars, Sarah had seen what really happened. He had frozen at the controls, panic locking him in place until it was too late. Hours later, he was cleared for duty and reassigned to another combat op. That night, she found Colonel Reeves alone in his office, hunched over paperwork under the harsh hum of fluorescent lights. The walls around him were lined with photographs from his own tours: Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia. A lifetime of service etched into every crease of his uniform and every line of his face. "Sir," she began, her voice steady but edged with the steel of someone done being overlooked. "With respect, I've logged more simulator hours than anyone in this." Sarah stood ramrod straight, her boots planted like anchors on the cold concrete floor. Her voice stayed steady, but there was no mistaking the heat simmering in her chest. "Sir, I'm the top pilot in the unit, and my gunnery scores are the highest ever recorded." Colonel Reeves looked up slowly from the stack of paperwork on his desk, his weather-beaten face settling into that familiar mask of skepticism Sarah had come to despise. Deep creases bracketed his eyes, not just from age but from decades of weighing life and death decisions. His gray hair was clipped to the same regulation length he'd worn for 30 years, an unyielding reminder of the man's discipline. "Mitchell, he said, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of experience. "Combat isn't about scores. It's about not freezing when the bullets start flying." Sarah's jaw tightened until she thought her teeth might crack. She forced herself to keep her voice respectful. "Then give me the chance to prove I won't freeze, sir." The air inside Fort Bragg's emergency briefing room was thick with tension. Across the front wall, massive screens projected the latest satellite imagery of Hurricane Katrina. Sarah had never seen weather like this, a monstrous spiral devouring half the Gulf Coast. Its wind speeds so extreme, even veteran pilots shook their heads in disbelief. Just an hour earlier, she'd been elbows deep in routine maintenance work when the call came in from New Orleans. Now she sat among 20 other aviators, all watching their commanding officers wrestle with what looked like an impossible rescue. Major Patricia Wells, the base's emergency response coordinator, stood at the podium. Usually she was a picture of composure, but tonight her voice carried a taut edge, her eyes scanning the room as she clicked through a grim series of aerial photos. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a code red in the lower Ninth Ward," she announced. "St. Mary's Children's Hospital sent out a distress call 40 minutes ago. 17 children and 6 staff members are trapped on the roof. The first 2 floors are completely flooded, and they're running out of time." Sarah leaned forward in her seat, eyes narrowing on the images. The hospital stood like a marooned fortress in an endless expanse of black water. Downed power lines hissed and sparked, writhing in the flood like electric snakes. The water was choked with debris, cars, uprooted trees, shattered walls, all scattered by the hurricane's wrath. It didn't look like a city anymore. It looked like a war zone. Commander Jake Morrison of the Coast Guard stepped up, his bright orange flight suit still dripping from his last rescue attempt. "We've already lost 2 helicopters trying to reach that area," he said grimly. "Winds are steady at 140 miles an hour, gusting to 180. Our Jayhawks can't handle those conditions. Not with debris flying like shrapnel." He ran a hand through his wet hair. "Power lines are down all over, and the electromagnetic interference is scrambling our navigation systems." From the front row, Colonel Reeves rose to his feet. "What about waiting for the eye to pass?" "Sir, the eye won't hit that sector for another 6 hours," Morrison replied. "Those kids don't have 6 hours. The water's still rising, and the roof they're on is already holding twice the weight it was built to support." Sarah's eyes locked on the weather radar. Her brain started ticking through flight school lessons. Storm structure, wind band rotation, load stress. The hurricane was massive, yes, but it was also predictable in its patterns. She could see the gaps forming in her mind. Her idea was dangerous, borderline suicidal, but maybe possible. "An Apache could make it through those winds," she said aloud, her voice slicing through the room's low hum. Silence. 24 pairs of eyes swung toward her, most filled with disbelief. Captain Rodriguez, 3 rows ahead, actually laughed. "Mitchell, you're talking about flying a gunship into a Category 5 hurricane." He swiveled in his chair to give her the kind of smirk she'd seen 100 times before. "Apaches aren't rescue birds. They're not equipped for medical evac." Sarah stood, feeling her pulse hammer in her neck, but keeping her voice even. "No, but they're built to take punishment. The armor plating, the reinforced airframe, they can survive hits that would tear a rescue chopper apart, and we could rig the external cargo system to carry people." Morrison shook his head sharply. "Lieutenant, I respect your drive, but what you're suggesting is beyond dangerous. It's impossible. The downdrafts alone would throw you into the water long before you reach the hospital." "Sir, I've studied the storm's structure," Sarah pressed on, already pulling her tablet from her flight bag. She tapped it, sending a projection of the radar data to the main screen. "Between the spiral bands, there are lulls, short windows where the wind drops to a level we can manage. If I time it right, I can ride those gaps straight to the target." The room exploded into overlapping voices, warnings about wind shear, debris fields, and the insanity of precision flying in a hurricane. Through the din, Sarah caught Reeves' gaze. His weathered face was still, unreadable, but his eyes stayed locked on her. "Even if you could reach the hospital," Major Wells cut in, "how would you get 17 children out? An Apache doesn't have passenger space." Sarah didn't hesitate. She'd already thought it through. "External rescue basket," she said. "Sir, it's the same system we use for cargo drops, only modified with safety harnesses," Sarah began, her voice steady but quick. "I could take them out 3 at a time." Morrison's eyes widened. That would mean 6 separate trips through the hurricane. His tone was rising now, disbelief sharpening every word. 6 flights through the kind of hell that's already killed 2 of my crews. "Then we change our approach," Sarah countered, her confidence hardening as the plan took shape in her mind. "I hover over the roof and use the cargo hook system to lift them straight into the aircraft's external basket. One run, all 17 kids, plus the staff." Captain Rodriguez shot to his feet, his face flushing an angry red. "This is insane. Mitchell, you've never flown a combat mission. You've never taken fire, never worked under real pressure, and now you're telling me you want to fly through a hurricane so you can play hero?" The words hit Sarah like a blow to the chest, but she didn't flinch. "You're right, Rodriguez. I've never been in combat, but I've also never crashed into a sand dune during a training exercise." The air in the room froze solid. Rodriguez's face deepened to a dangerous crimson, and several pilots ducked their heads, hiding smirks they didn't dare show. Everyone knew about that particular mishap of his, but no one had said it out loud. Not until now. Colonel Reeves cut through the tension with a voice sharp enough to slice steel. "Mitchell, what you're proposing isn't heroics, it's suicide. Those children need rescuing, not another casualty." Sarah turned toward him, meeting his eyes head on. "Sir, 17 children are stranded on that roof. The water's rising. The building's failing, and every second we argue that is a second closer to losing them all. She let that hang in the air, letting the reality weigh on the room. I know the mission's dangerous. I know the odds are bad, but I also know the Apache can handle conditions that would tear apart anything else we've got. Her gaze swept the room, faces tense, doubtful, a few reluctantly impressed. I'm not asking to be a hero. I'm asking for the chance to save 17 children's lives. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then Reeves stood, the weight of command visible in the set of his shoulders. Mitchell, get your flight gear. You've got 30 minutes to prep your bird and brief your crew chief on the modifications. Sarah moved for the door, but Rodriguez's voice followed her. When you crash that Apache into the Gulf, don't expect us to risk more lives fishing you out. She stopped at the threshold, turning just enough to show him a smile that didn't come close to her eyes. I won't crash, Rodriguez, but thanks for the vote of confidence. Her hands were trembling as she strapped herself into the Apache's cockpit. The pre-flight checklist felt almost unreal against the looming wall of the storm. Through her visor, the horizon was swallowed by a moving fortress of black clouds, an army of darkness marching toward the Louisiana coast. Staff Sergeant Schoen had worked near miracles in the short 30 minutes, rigging an emergency rescue basket to the cargo hook, threading an extra safety cables strong enough to hold several passengers at once. Ghost, this is Tower Control. Major Wells' voice crackled into her headset. Latest weather shows sustained winds at 145, gusts to 190. You absolutely sure about this? Her finger hovered over the engine start. Every logical part of her brain screamed, don't do it. But behind her eyes, all she could see were 17 terrified children huddled on a rooftop. Tower Control, she replied. Ghost is committed. Beginning engine start sequence. The twin turbo shafts roared awake, the familiar rising whine a small anchor in the chaos. Bon chamas. She moved through her final systems checks. Her Apache, tail number 847, had never failed her in 3 years of training flights. Today she was asking it to defy not only the limits of the manual, but maybe the laws of physics themselves. Ghost, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed, Lieutenant. Sarah pulled collective, feeling the lift as the Apache left the tarmac, maybe for the last time. The first wind gust hit immediately, tossing the helicopter like a toy as she clawed for cruising altitude. Ahead, the hurricane's outer bands reared up, walls of rain and wind stretching from the Gulf to the stratosphere. Crossing into it was like slamming into a solid wall. One second she was wrestling mild turbulence. The next, the Apache was trying to roll inverted under the force of 120-mile-an-hour crosswinds. Rain struck the windscreen like machine gun fire. Visibility gone in an instant. Her instruments became her only tether to reality as the outside world dissolved into chaos. Jesus, she muttered, fighting a brutal downdraft determined to drive her into the boiling sea below. Far below, the dark waters of the Gulf churned like something alive, swallowing whole streets and tossing debris into the air. The Apache's twin engines howled in protest as Sarah pushed them to their limit, clawing for altitude. Shattered chunks of buildings, twisted street signs, and even entire uprooted trees spun past her rotor blades. Lethal missiles carried on the hurricane's breath. Lightning split the sky in blinding bursts, each flash searing her vision white for a heartbeat before the darkness slammed back in. Every strike sent jagged surges of electromagnetic interference rippling through her avionics, making the cockpit lights flicker like a dying carnival ride. The navigation display stuttered, then went black entirely, leaving her with nothing but her compass and dead reckoning to steer by. Primitive tools in the middle of a storm that seemed intent on tearing her from the sky. Her radio dissolved into a wall of static. No voices, no updates from base, no backup. Just her, the roar of the storm, and the sense of being completely, terrifyingly alone in a world made of screaming wind and sheets of blinding rain. Sarah had studied hurricanes in meteorology classes. Pages of diagrams, data charts, wind speed graphs. None of it had prepared her for the reality. This wasn't weather. It was a living creature, a predator made of air and water, striking from all directions at once. The wind didn't just blow. It lunged, it shoved, it clawed. Vortices spun out of nowhere, downdrafts hammered her from above, and the Apache tossed and bucked like a furious bull desperate to throw its rider. The airframe groaned under stresses it had never been designed to endure. Every jolt rattled through her seat and into her bones. "Come on, girl," she murmured to the helicopter, her voice almost lost in the roar. "We've got kids counting on us." A flicker on the GPS. Finally a signal lock. 15 miles still to go. Her heart sank. Headwinds were cutting her ground speed down to barely 40 knots. At this rate, the fuel gauge's silent warning was more than just a threat. It was a countdown. She shoved the throttles forward, sacrificing efficiency for raw speed, and dipped the nose toward the drowned city. New Orleans emerged through the chaos like some vision dragged straight from hell. The lower Ninth Ward lay under black water, rooftops and tree crowns jutting from the surface like the bones of a drowned giant. Electrical lines whipped and sparked in the wind, lashing like enraged serpents. Floating islands of debris, walls, furniture, cars, shifted and collided in the flood, breaking apart and reforming with each surge of water. Sarah's chest tightened. She'd never seen destruction on this scale. Not in combat, not in disaster relief. An entire city swallowed whole. A break in the rain gave her a glimpse of the hospital, a pale shape, its white roof barely standing out amid the ruin. Once surrounded by quiet residential streets, it now sat marooned in a churning lake, scattered with the wreckage of homes. Tiny figures huddled on the roof. Even from this height, she could tell, children clinging to the staff who'd kept them alive through the night. Landing, impossible. Power lines crisscrossed the area, flailing and snapping with enough force to shear through her rotor blades like a cleaver through rope. The roof was too small for the Apache's footprint, and from the sagging lines in the structure, she doubted it could bear the weight even if she tried. That left one option, a hover extraction using the rescue basket, a precision maneuver under perfect skies. But here, in a hurricane, it was like threading a needle on the back of a bucking horse while the needle was trying to kill you. She eased the Apache into a hover, 20 feet over the roof, fighting invisible fists of air that tried to slam her into the neighboring ruins. Through the chin bubble glass, she saw them clearly now. Small faces, wide-eyed and wet with rain, some streaked with tears. Tiny hands clutched the arms of the adults beside them. The rescue basket swayed violently in the wind as she lowered it. The first group, 3 small shapes, bundled into bright life jackets, were guided into the basket by a nurse who looked like she was using every ounce of strength just to stay upright. Sarah locked her focus on the instruments, keeping her position steady through nothing but muscle and willpower. Her forearms ached, her back burned, but she didn't let the cyclic slip. Then a blast from the side caught the tail rotor. The Apache spun 30 degrees before she could counter. The basket swung like a pendulum, missing the roof by barely a foot before she hauled it back under control. "Easy, easy," she breathed, sweat dripping into her eyes despite the cockpit's air conditioning. She winched the basket up, the children staring at her with wide, silent eyes, then lowered it again for the next load. Every lift was a battle, every successful one, a tiny victory wrestled from the storm. On the 4th run, disaster came within a heartbeat of winning. She'd just begun raising a basket carrying 4 children when a massive gust slammed into her broadside. The Apache lurched sideways toward a cell tower looming out of the rain, its skeletal metal frame like a giant's fingers reaching for her. Training took over. She dumped collective, letting the Apache drop under the tower with inches to spare. The basket whipped wildly, but the children clung on, and she fought the aircraft back into a stable hover. The final lift was the most fragile, the smallest children, and the 2 nurses who refused to leave them behind. Sarah glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle was in the red. Her engines were running hot, warning lights flashing across the console in chaotic rhythm, but there was no stopping now. 17 children, 2 nurses, all depending on her to get them out. She lowered the basket one last time, feeling the storm pressing harder against her, as if the hurricane itself knew she was almost free and wanted to crush her before she escaped. Metal shrieked against metal as the Apache's frame scraped past the tower, a tortured, grinding scream that somehow cut through the hurricane's roaring fury. Sparks erupted in the night, scattering in the wind before vanishing into the rain. Sarah felt the jolt reverberate through the aircraft, a shudder that told her the tail's anti-torque system had taken a hit. The rotor still spun, but control authority was hanging by a thread. She could still fly, but just barely. "Hold on, kids," she murmured into her intercom. She knew the children dangling far below couldn't hear her over the howling storm, but she needed to say it anyway, as much for herself as for them. "We're going home." Her Apache groaned like a wounded animal as she coaxed it toward the storm's core. 17 lives clung to the rescue basket below, swaying in the chaos, their fate resting entirely in her hands. With every gust, every lurch of the crippled aircraft, she wrestled with failing hydraulics and the unrelenting power of the hurricane. The cell tower strike had chewed into her tail rotor's authority, forcing her into an exhausting dance of power adjustments and cyclic control to keep the Apache from spinning itself into oblivion. Her cockpit glowed an ominous red as warning lights flared, hydraulic pressure bleeding away, engine temperatures climbing toward the danger zone. Over the headset, beneath the roar and crackle of interference, she could hear faint, muffled sobs. The tiny voices of the children filtered through the storm, fragile and desperate. They dangled below her, suspended by cables and prayers, and she refused to let them fall. It struck her, bitter and strange, how 3 years of being passed over for combat missions had led to this. Flying the most dangerous sortie of her career, carrying the most precious cargo she could imagine. She reached out to the machine the way a soldier might speak to a comrade on the brink. "Come on, 847, she whispered to the Apache, using its tail number like a prayer. "Just a little further, girl. These kids are counting on us." The fuel gauge was deep in the red, the needle trembling over empty. That wasn't hours of flying time, it was minutes. She had calculated the return trip on normal burn rates, but hurricane headwinds at full power had eaten her reserves alive. Now it was a race, not just against the storm, but against gravity itself, with the flooded wasteland below waiting to swallow them if the engines died first. The radio spat static into her ear, fragments of Fort Bragg's transmissions clawing their way through the electromagnetic chaos. "Do you copy? Fuel state, abort mission." The words came in broken shards, but she could hear the worry in her fellow pilots' voices. They thought she was gone, another name to add to the storm's toll, like the 2 Coast Guard helicopters already claimed. Then it hit, a massive downdraft, invisible but brutal, snatching her Apache out of the sky and shoving it toward the raging Gulf waters. The altimeter spun downward in sickening freefall. Sarah yanked the collective to its limit, the twin engines screaming their protest. The rescue basket whipped and swung violently, the children's terrified faces flickering in the strobe of lightning. At 50 feet above the foaming waves, she managed to arrest the plunge, muscles burning from the effort, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Ahead, the hurricane's back wall towered like a fortress of black cloud, its massive column rising into the stratosphere. This was the beast's most violent quadrant, where winds tore at everything with feral claws and debris flew like shrapnel. She didn't have the luxury of going around. The fuel wouldn't last, and the children's time was slipping away. She dove toward wave top level, hoping the lower altitude might spare her from the most vicious gusts. The moment she crossed into the wall, it was like flying into a blender. A savage vortex seized the Apache, spinning it like a T-main, the damaged tail rotor fighting and failing to keep pace. Sarah gritted her teeth and muscled the controls, every tendon in her arms and shoulders straining as she fought the storm's relentless grip. Lightning struck, once, twice, hammering the aircraft in blinding flashes. The first hit killed her navigation computer outright, leaving her with nothing but compass bearings and instinct to guide her through a world of zero visibility. The second strike fried her fuel flow indicator. Now she didn't even know exactly how much flight time remained. Then she heard it, that subtle, deadly change in the engine's oi song. The whine had shifted, surging and fading in uneven bursts. They were starving for fuel. Minutes left, maybe less, before the Apache became nothing more than a falling hulk. The children didn't know, their voices still floated up through the headset, thin, broken calls for their parents. Sarah bared her teeth, her voice low and fierce. "Not today," she growled. "We're not dying today." She shoved the throttles forward, ignoring the rising heat warnings. Through the writhing chaos ahead, she spotted it, a faint glow breaking through the darkness. Sunlight, soft and golden, bleeding through the thinning wall of the cloud. The edge of the eye wall was close. Clear air and safety lay just beyond. Beyond the last furious wall of wind and rain, Sarah fixed her eyes on a single distant light. It was her guiding star, a stubborn pinprick in the chaos, a beacon that pulled her forward as her Apache helicopter rattled, shuddered, and groaned under the hurricane's dying but still brutal assault. Then, all at once, the storm let her go. One moment she was swallowed whole, flying blind through blinding sheets of rain, the cockpit buffeted by screaming wind that rattled her teeth. The next, she exploded into daylight so fierce and sudden she had to squint behind her visor. The transformation was violent, almost unreal, like being ripped out of hell and dropped into heaven in the space of a heartbeat. Behind her, the hurricane still clawed at the world, ripping and tearing across the coast with unchecked fury. Ahead, the familiar patchwork of Louisiana farmland stretched toward the horizon, shimmering under a deceptively peaceful afternoon sun. And far in the distance, the faint silhouette of Fort Bragg began to take shape. Her fuel pumps coughed once, twice. Then the engine started running rough, gulping at the last fumes in her tanks. She could see the base now, runways glinting, hangars miraging in the heat haze. She wasn't going to arrive with style. She wasn't going to arrive with power to spare. But she was going to arrive. Barely. She switched to the base channel, her voice hoarse from hours of shouting over the storm. Fort Bragg Tower, this is Ghost, inbound with 17 souls on board, requesting immediate medical assistance and emergency landing clearance. The reply came back without hesitation, thick with relief. Ghost, thank God you're alive. We have ambulances standing by. You are cleared for immediate landing on any runway. She brought the Apache down fast and steep, fighting to keep her descent under control. The engines gave their last just as the landing gear kissed the tarmac. The touchdown was hard, more of a controlled crash than a landing, but the machine stayed upright. The helicopter's battered systems finally surrendered, shutting down in a weary sigh of metal and smoke after their improbable fight for survival. Emergency crews sprinted toward the smoking aircraft. Sarah began the careful process of lowering the rescue basket. One by one, the children emerged, small miracles against the odds, faces smeared with dirt and streaked with tears, but breathing, alive. Paramedics swarmed them, checking pulses, wrapping blankets, ushering them to waiting vehicles. News cameras recorded every fragile moment of their salvation. Still strapped into her seat, Sarah moved through her shutdown checklist, fingers trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere to go. The reality of what had just happened, the hours of relentless flying, the gamble she'd taken, was finally catching up to her. When she climbed out at last, Colonel Reeves was waiting. His weathered face was unreadable at first, a mixture of controlled fury and something she'd never seen from him before, genuine admiration. Standing just behind him was Captain Rodriguez, his trademark arrogance replaced with something far rarer from him, respect. Mitchell, Reeves said, his voice firm but missing the usual bite. You just violated about 50 regulations and nearly got yourself killed. Sarah pulled off her helmet. Despite her sweat-matted hair, her soaked flight suit, and the pounding fatigue in every muscle, a slow, defiant grin spread across her face. Her eyes were alight, not with cockiness, but with the hard-earned satisfaction of a mission pulled off against impossible odds. But I didn't crash, sir. Reeves stared at her for a long beat, the corner of his mouth finally curving upward. No, Lieutenant, he said slowly. You certainly did not crash. 6 months later, she was Captain Sarah Hurricane Mitchell, leading combat missions over Syria. Her call sign wasn't born from bravado or politics, but from that one impossible flight that proved a truth the brass could no longer ignore. Courage wasn't about gender, politics, or perception. It was about doing the thing that had to be done when lives were on the line. The 17 children she'd rescued never forgot. They sent letters, hand-drawn pictures, bright crayon sketches of helicopters and angels with her name scrawled across the top. They called her their guardian angel. Sarah knew better. She wasn't an angel, she was a A pilot who had been given one chance to prove that when the impossible needed doing, she was exactly the person you wanted in the cockpit. No one ever questioned whether she belonged there again.